Well, firstly, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are all really excited to have a really good discussion. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land which we are meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I'd also just like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today in the room or on the live stream as well. So yeah, like I said, welcome. This is another one of the Wheeler Centre's instalments of Teens Talk. This topic is on consent, and my name is Noah. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm really proudly representing an organisation called Consent Labs, which I've worked for about a year and a half now as a facilitator, program script writer, and currently working on a bit of their strategy too. I'm joined by two other amazing young people, so introduce yourselves. Welcome.
Hi, my name's Joudy and I'm currently a Year 10 student. I use she, her pronouns, and I just want to say I'm really excited to be here and I'm happy to be able to have a discussion about consent and sex education and everything today.
Hi, I'm Izabella. I use she, her pronouns. I am an ex-student. I have graduated. I'm old now. And honestly, I ditto everything Joudy just said. Yeah, very excited and happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, should we get into it?
Totally.
Yeah.
So I guess I want to begin our chat today on a very micro level, which is our experiences within sex ed classrooms. Usually that takes place in a health or PE kind of setting with health or PE teachers. So maybe Joudy, I'll just ask about your experience up to this point in those sort of classroom environments.
Yeah, so Consent Labs actually came to our school, which was a really great experience because if I'm being honest, that was one of the first honest discussions that were had about consent. Obviously, we've talked about sex education multiple times in health, but you walk in and there's sex ed written on the board and you all sit around and the dreaded tea video comes up or some variation. I've heard riding a bicycle, even the milkshake video. You walk into class and you watch the video and you have someone ask some random question about what's the tea meant to mean as a joke, and everyone giggles and that's the end of the class. So I feel that in school, especially in high school, you don't have conversations about consent just straight up in relation to intimacy and sex and other things in your life. It's a lot hidden behind innuendos and hidden behind, we can't say the word, but you know what we're talking about. So I'd say that consent education needs a lot of development and it needs a lot more openness.
Yeah.
And you, Izabella?
Yeah, honestly, a lot of the same kind of experience. I didn't have consent labs in my school. Our education was fractured. At my first school, a lot of it was under the guise of, human development. So we're going to talk about biology and this goes there and this creates a baby. Or if you put this here, this doesn't create a baby. But then also we had, the school brought in self-defense teachers, to teach us to trust your gut and this is how you get out of this situation. And if you find yourself in this situation, this is what not to do. And going to two single-sex female-based schools, a lot of it was, when we were talking about sex or consent, structured around when someone violated your boundaries, rather than what consent is as a whole. It was always about, this is going to happen to you at some point and this is how to protect yourself. Never anything more nuanced than that.
That's really interesting, and I think that the basic consent education at its core was missing in so many young people's, in so many of those health classes and stuff. I don't think during my high school experience, I even heard the fact that consent is an enthusiastic yes, and phrases like the absence of a no does not mean yes. These really fundamental things that need to be spoken about in relation to consent were never even said once.
Yeah.
And very similarly, it was, for me, very biological too. And coming from a single-sex male background, there was no discussion about what happens if consent isn't gained and given, which I think is really important to discuss, particularly in some of those environments where, like we know, the majority of perpetrators are males. So there wasn't even an active effort to engage young boys in my environment into that discussion at all. I think that it is definitely important to discuss the difference between sex education and consent education. So I guess maybe you just want to pass over to maybe you, Izabella, about what you think the difference between how consent education should look compared to sex education, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. The first thing I think we all need to make clear is that consent doesn't just exist in romantic, intimate relationships. It doesn't. We use and give our boundaries and establish our boundaries in everyday life. Every day we do it, yet for some reason you add the activity of having sex into the mix and, oh my God, there's murky waters all of a sudden. No, there isn't. You've just somehow isolated the two from each other. Kids, no consent. All you have to do is look at a crying baby sitting on a strange man's lap and it's like, oh, it's Santa, it's fine. No, the kid doesn't want to be there, but we're forcing the kid to be there. But even in medical terms, the doctor asks, okay, are you okay if I put this here now? Yes. Okay, so when it is then established in intimacy, why are we all so confused? And I think that's the difference between sex ed, which is we can establish to be a safe and, say, more biological lesson, if that's what you please, but that is inclusive of everyone. The same way consent needs to be inclusive of all of its forms. Sex needs to be inclusive of all of its forms, and that's just not a heteronormative form. That includes everyone.
100%. I think that's actually... You raised some very, very good points, and I'd just like to highlight the last thing you talked about, which was thinking about everyone when we're talking about consent, and especially acknowledging diversity when we're talking about consent, talking about gender diversity, sexuality diversity, race, religion. All of these different things influence the way that we've been taught about how we should be in sexual interactions, but also kind of definitely implicates the way we will in the future. So maybe I'll ask you, Joudy, what in terms of your consent education or even sex education so far, I know you said that it was quite biological and methodical. Was there any inclusion of diverse identities?
One thing that I was shocked by when I entered the class was that was not even a mention of anything like same-sex relationships, even different types of intimate relationships. It was always like, you have a boyfriend and eventually you guys are going to have sex, and when you have sex, this is what's going to happen. It was never inclusive of anything or any of these societal boundaries that are very much prevalent in our world. There was never any discussion of that or that in relation to consent or sex. So it was a very one-sided narrative of this is what sex is, this is how it works, this is how it's going to go. And then you're left with people who are already vulnerable in our society. They don't have access to consent education and sex education in their schools. They have to find resources online, and it shouldn't have to come to having to find extra resources because your school doesn't want to diversify their consent and sex education policies or who teaches them or anything like that. So it leaves a lot of vulnerable people not having access to consent education, which I think is really important.
Yeah.
100%. I think that's a really, really good point. And on top of that, right now, up until this point, schools have had to outsource consent education to someone like Consent Labs, which is awesome because it gives us opportunities to educate people who haven't encountered that, but it means that schools who are maybe poorer or schools in rural environments and stuff, they have no opportunities to even engage students in those sorts of discussions. So I think that's a really good point that you make as well. I guess I'd just like to move on and think about now the impact that avoiding all of these taboo topics has on maybe our childhood and our teenagehood. So maybe, Izabella, what was like the cultural environment past just the classroom, but at lunchtime, after school, at parties and etc., that you experienced around sex and consent?
Yeah, it was bizarre, to say the least. You've got a group of people who are all at different stages of experiencing life and what they are and aren't ready to do. And then you've also got people who probably had questions in those classes that wanted answers and are now facing those real life scenarios and don't know what to do. And they don't know how to interact with that. They don't know that this anxious feeling of this guy trying to kiss me right now isn't actually excitement. That's me saying, I'm not comfortable with this and I don't want to do it, but I haven't been allowed to voice that before. So all of a sudden I'm in this situation that I don't want to be in, but I feel guilty for that. Or my friends come to me going, I just didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I just kind of made out with him anyway. Huh? What? When did we make that okay? That's not a learning experience for teens. That's not you're growing. No, that's trauma. Yeah. That's traumatizing for teens. And no wonder all of a sudden we deal with these problems of, well, what did you say? I didn't say anything. What do you mean you didn't say anything? And it's so overwhelming. And then you get to school and you can tell the teacher that's teaching you is uncomfortable because they've clearly just been told that this is the class they need to teach now. You have questions, but you're not necessarily feeling safe because, are these people going to judge me? I don't know if they're experiencing the same thing as me. Maybe I'm the one that made the mistake, so I'm just going to sit here and not say anything. And then you're left to deal with it by yourself and you're isolated again. Yet we keep on being told, everyone does it. There's no shame. It's not embarrassing. But clearly we're still feeling shame. Clearly it's still, for some reason, making people embarrassed. Why are we not addressing that?
I think you raised two really, really important points. The first one is that the truth is that there are a lot of schools out there, because of religious affiliations, conservative ties, even just the fact that no staff member may feel comfortable delivering consent education, then as a result of that, they avoid it. And what happens when they avoid it, or maybe even try and take away any resource that they could give to students to access kind of ideas and learnings about sex and consent, is they start to think, well, if we don't expose these students to these resources, then maybe they won't engage in sex and won't actually have to think about consent until they're adults or whatever. And the truth is that's not the case. Whether young people are engaging in sex themselves, or whether they are engaging in discussions around sex, or they're giving advice to their friends about sex, or all of these different sorts of things, it's happening. And there's no way that just taking away resources to students, particularly in the era of social media and even just what we see on TV, on Netflix movies, like, we have an abundance of access to what we think sex may look like, but we're not being taught how we can healthily engage.
Exactly. And with that, I also don't think that for a lot of schools I've been listening and hearing, teachers are necessarily given the resources to also grapple with this, because there is something so fundamentally flawed if you are forcing a teacher to do a talk about consent and they are uncomfortable talking about it in front of their students. How on earth are you supposed to portray and start a healthy discourse with the people you are trying to help if you yourself don't feel supported? This issue goes back and back and back, and what needs to be made okay is that discussion, is that, okay, I don't know everything, but what do you need from me? We need to be making sure that everyone's on even footing in that conversation, and it doesn't take much more than a discussion.
100%, completely agreed. I'd also like to touch on one other thing that you spoke about, which was the fact that in a lot of those environments you didn't feel, or people didn't feel safe to express their ideas because of being judged and that sort of thing. I guess my question maybe to Joudy is, what do you think contributes, particularly because you're still in school and experiencing this every day, not even in the health or PE classroom, but in any classroom, what contributes to students not feeling safe, who's to give their views? Who's responsible for that? What do you think?
I definitely think that because of this hush-hush attitude about consent and sex, you find that there's a stigma, and it builds up from primary school when they split the boys and the girls up, and you have a little cheeky laugh because they said a word that you're not meant to say at school. And then the stigma just builds up, and suddenly you're in high school and you're at a party and someone's behind you and you're thinking, I'm not really comfortable with this, but I don't know what to do in this situation. And you just stand there and you let it happen. And then you find that because of the stigma, you can't even talk about it, about the things you've experienced, because you just think, people are going to think I'm being overdramatic, or this isn't a real issue, this is just a part of life, this is normal, this is being a teenager. And especially for women, this is part of being a woman, is that when you're out at a party and someone comes behind you, you just accept it, you let it happen to you, and you're not meant to say anything about it. And the stigma builds into adulthood. And I feel that a lot of these conversations about sex education and consent, there's like this assumption, as soon as you become an adult, all of a sudden, you know everything there is to know about sex and consent, and all of a sudden you're bestowed with this wisdom, like, wow, I just know everything. But that's not true. You carry this stigma with you into adulthood, and you find it in things like the workplace. You find that just being outside, at a club, wherever you are, you just find that the stigma continues to build up. So to stop this kind of cycle of just constant misinformation, and because of that misinformation, you're getting a lot of traumatizing experiences that people shouldn't be having to go through. There needs to be proper consent education and sex education, and the stigma around it needs to end, because at this point it's just damaging people more than the people that think that maybe sex is like teaching your children about sex is harmful in some way. I think that not teaching them about consent and sex is just going to make it harder for them to adapt in a real world where things like that do happen, and they're going to grow up thinking that it's okay when it's most definitely not.
So what do you think that, you spoke about proper sex and consent education. For you, and particularly in your experience in school right now, what do you think that should look like?
I think it should look like, first of all, not splitting the boys and the girls up, because in primary school, the girls, they got to talk about, do not ever partake in any of those sexual activities. You shouldn't be doing any of that. And if something happens to you, it's your fault. It's because of what you were wearing, your attitude, maybe you smiled at them. And then the boys, they just got told, oh, you know, one day you're going to be a big boy and you're going to do things and make sure you have fun. So you find that girls grow up thinking, oh my God, it's going to happen to me eventually and I'm scared and I can't control what happens to me. And you have boys who haven't been taught to ask for consent, and girls who haven't been taught to ask for consent either. You get this kind of, no one's had a proper conversation about it, an honest conversation. It's just hush hush. So I think it needs to be explicit, it needs to be honest, and it needs to be emphasized that consent is an enthusiastic yes, and consent isn't some taboo thing. It's not going to ruin the mood or anything like that. It's something that is necessary for any intimate or even non-intimate interaction that you're having in your life.
100%, yeah.
100%. And I definitely think you raised a really good point as well, about the way that we interact with different genders in this discussion. And it is something that is tackled differently, and it's definitely something I want to chat about a little bit. My perspective is 100% the same as yours. We shouldn't be splitting boys and girls up, because this is, and anyone up, because this is a discussion that involves everyone, implicates everyone, but we have to understand that in agreeing that everyone needs to be there, there are power dynamics at play that that need to be thought about. The truth is that the vast majority of perpetrators of sexual assault are men, which can kind of develop into, when we talk about consent education and the fact that maybe we need to be emphasising this statistic, it can deter men away from the discussion. We need to be able to think of a way to have positive discussions around sex, consent, which involves everyone, but is explicit in its message, if that makes sense. And that can be a really hard kind of dichotomy to grapple. What do you think the best way to engage everyone in the discussion is whilst acknowledging those differences?
100%. Firstly, I think it's making sure that we are acutely aware of the language we're using. When including everyone and talking about these real-life experiences, there's been a conception with how we speak, say, about assault and consent and everything between those two, that it's a rejection if someone says no, that it's you're owed this, like even the terminology of did you get to second base? Did you get to third base? That's a win and lose situation. That is a reference to there is a power dynamic that needs to be addressed. But to involve everyone in that conversation, to really deconstruct that language, we need to be actively listening to the people we're talking to. And every classroom is going to be different. And you're going to have to establish that footing in a plethora of different ways. But if you're doing it with compassion and respect at your core, with your empathy intact, you are going to be able to establish a safe environment. People may not be receptive right there in the moment, but when they are treated with decency, people 9 times out of 10 are going to turn around and behave decently. And often when you see people not responding that way, when there's this initial defensiveness or aggression or they feel like they're under attack, there's a reason for that. And that doesn't deserve to be shamed. People need to feel safe enough in these classrooms and in these discussions to mess up, because you're human and you're going to do that. You're going to accidentally bump into someone sometime and you say sorry. That's okay. And that's going to happen in that class. You're going to say something, a thought's going to come out that you didn't even realise you had. You didn't even realise was rooted in a plethora of problematic thinking. That's okay. That can be addressed and discussed with compassion. It doesn't need to be shamed. But that also means you hold people accountable, and that accountability is then taken, listened to, and expanded on. That means you have to be ready to adapt.
I completely agree, and I really want to hone in on the idea of a safe space, and particularly for teachers who may be concerned about how they tackle consent, or how they even tackle the topic of sex if that comes up in any subject. I think the most important thing is creating that safe space for people to stumble on their words, to say something that they are okay with having being challenged. On top of that, I think a really important part of engaging everyone, be it men, women, anyone who identifies otherwise, is coming from a place of empathy. Because as a teacher standing up at the front, you cannot say I've been in every single one of your position, because everyone comes from different life experiences. But when we listen to other people and we think about where their contributions are actually coming from a place of empathy rather than an us versus them mindset, I think that may be one of the biggest kind of ways that we can actually start making change. Personally, I think when engaging with young boys, it's important to, whilst we never accept anything, any kind of harmful or detrimental ideas, give them a place to share their ideas in a kind of comfortable environment where we can actually have an active discussion about it, rather than either just shutting it down or rather than letting them run loose about, in some environments, about what those, like what the issues are with what those ideas, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And also, people deep down to their core are genuinely good. There are very few people out there who just want to hurt others, who are just plain evil and just don't care about anyone ever. That's not how we're made. So acknowledging that these two things can coexist. You can have the best intentions and have some of the worst views because of whatever, because of your background, because things and thoughts that have somehow stuck in your head were only ever spoken about once and they've never been readdressed. That's okay, that's what growth is. And if you're trying to educate people, then creating that space that allows people to acknowledge those thoughts and let them come to that conclusion, because majority of us are fully capable of doing so.
100%. Joudy, what do you think so far in your experience in high school, like your experience of that safe space is? It doesn't matter if you're in health or if you're in English or maths or whatever. I know it can be difficult to put your hand up and contribute, particularly if you're not the loudest person in the room. What do you think can help people feel more comfortable to contribute in environments?
I think that, well, I've basically touched on stigma already, so that's a major contributor, I think, to why a lot of people don't want to speak up. But it's also this like innate fear that's in all of us of being rejected, or feeling like we don't understand something, like we're the dumb person in the room, like we're the only one who doesn't get it. So I think a really important part of making sure that everyone feels safe enough to contribute is to make sure that what we're teaching is really comprehensive and that it's easy to understand, and that there isn't shame about asking questions or not understanding something or needing clarification or having just an honest discussion. I think that when you creating a safe environment is creating an environment where everyone can honestly speak their mind without judgment, and having an honest conversation and having a conversation that's rooted in trying to help others rather than just teaching this and let's move on, I'm teaching this because I have to. Just having that open space available for people to have a discussion is what's going to make people feel more safe contributing or asking questions or clarifying things.
100%. And obviously this is something that's particularly important when we talk about sex and consent, and that education. And I guess I can definitely understand where a staff member or a teacher or anyone would come from when they just want to avoid the conversation because they're worried that they'll mess up. So when we're thinking about how consent education should be rolled out to schools, I think it's really important that we educate the educators first, and that educators they feel comfortable, like you said, sharing. They feel comfortable in the material and they feel like they're not teaching things that they don't know. The problem is that so much of consent and sex education you can't find in a textbook, and it's got more to do with real life situations. What do you think some strategies could be for teachers in like classroom environments when they need to keep that dynamic of they're the teacher, but they also want to say like, well, like this is something that everyone goes through. What do you kind of think a staff member can do to not just make it sound like they're preaching straight from a textbook?
Yeah, 100%. There's, again, kind of like I said earlier, I genuinely believe every class will be different and the approach therefore needs to be like that as well. I also think a handy situation and a helpful one, if available to those members, is having a third party present, having someone that either the students feel comfortable with, a teacher that they feel safe with, or even an organisation like Consent Labs coming in with the teachers, having those discussions with the teachers, figuring out and asking, what's your hesitation? What, when you are faced with that room full of students, makes you pause and stumble and feel awkward? Is it because you feel like there's a line that we're crossing, talking about sex, and everyone has sex, and oh my God, they're going to start thinking about me having sex, I don't want to deal with that? Or is it, oh, actually, I'm just, from the background that I've come from, I don't think I'm going to be able to actually relate to the students, and therefore I feel like I'm a bit of an imposter here? Asking those questions and then establishing what groundwork needs to be laid to relay accurate and helpful and respectful information back to your students. And that can also involve asking the students, what do they want to see? Do they want a teacher that they know and trust teaching them this? Or would they prefer to have a completely third party that they've never met before come in and talk to them about that? That may be easier. That actually may be harder. They may feel more isolated. Do they want specific smaller classes? Classes with students that you know work well with each other, that aren't going to judge each other? Or is it completely randomized? Do we need to change how that's structured? But making sure that the conversation, and especially the class, isn't isolated from the rest of your school environment, because that is only going to hurt the teachers and it's only going to hurt the students, because it shouldn't be isolated. It's a part of everyday life and it should be treated the same.
100%. And I completely agree with you. And I think maybe one thing that a staff member may worry about is mandatory reporting, which is something that does need to be considered when you are delivering all of this information that can be quite personal, that there will be people in the room. If they share some of their experiences, suddenly it's out of the staff member's hands, which can be a challenging thing to grapple. And I guess I can understand why that may be a reason to want to avoid teaching consent, because we know that it's illegal when consent doesn't happen. And if someone shares their experiences, a staff member has a mandatory reporting requirement. I think the balance is sharing a space where students can ask questions, feel comfortable, but acknowledge that if they do share experiences of a certain nature, like of sexual assault, that it has to be taken forward. Because I do think mandatory reporting is really important, but it definitely needs to be something in the forefront of any educator's mind when they are delivering consent education.
Just with that, so exactly with what you've said, there's a whole another tool right there. Establish those boundaries and guidelines with your students. Have the first thing you do ask, is this going to make you guys uncomfortable? Anonymously tell me what about this makes you uncomfortable. These are what the guidelines that I need to follow are. What guidelines do you want me to follow? What do you need from me to feel safe in this space? And here's what I need from you to feel that you are safe here, so that we can work together. And if there is stuff that comes up there, it can be addressed at the forefront. It's not backpedaling, because that is our problem. We are doing way too much backpedaling. Oh, wait, no, I didn't say that I had to do that, but I didn't say... That doesn't need to be the case. It's very easily sorted out. Yeah, sorry.
No.
Just an adding.
No, 100%. That's such a good point. And I definitely think like the discussion around consent and all sex education definitely differs from the content and the way that teachers usually deliver content, which is standing up the front. Generally, a better teacher will engage their students in discussion, but it's definitely I'm talking to them type scenario. But suddenly young people are asking for discussion-based education where they feel involved in sharing their views, which is amazing, but teachers aren't prepared for that, I think, if that makes sense. So maybe a part of educating the educators is kind of rethinking the environment that they're so used to teaching in. Do you have any thoughts, Joudy?
I think that there needs to be adapting. Like, we need to adapt to this new environment that we're living in, where things like the introduction of social media, kids are having access to the internet at a much younger age, and you're getting a group of children who are growing up and every information is at their fingertips. And they don't want to sit there and look at a textbook and learn. They want to have a discussion, a nuanced discussion where they're not talking about just this is the fact. It's about their societal considerations. Like, we're looking at consent in not just schools but around different sectors of life, adulthood, childhood, everything like that. So adapting to all of these new circumstances is rethinking the structure of education, where it's not just a teacher sits at the front, they write some things on the board, you take down notes, you get some homework, and that's it. It's having a discussion in class where students are not just learning the material, but they're learning how to engage, which is especially important with consent.
I think that's an amazing point, because you're completely right. We are all growing up in an age completely different to where most teachers came from. Particularly in the fact that we do have so much information, and a lot of information about how sex is portrayed coming from different angles. So suddenly we're not learning the majority of what we need to know about the real world from school. We're learning it from social media, from television, film, and then in terms of sex, from pornography as well. And we know that a lot of the displays of sex and a lot of the displays of consent in these kind of settings are not correct, and can be really harmful. Do either of you have any real thoughts about that?
Yeah, 100%. This, especially with the display of sex in media and how it's everywhere, it's in everything you look at, and that's fine. And people are going to interact with that differently. But consent isn't. And it's very damaging, because it establishes this point of view that consent is like a roadblock to a good time. That, I have to stop and ask if they're okay with this. I have to stop. Well, the mood's gone. The imaginary romantic music in my head, that's completely stopped now. No. Where did we develop this idea that when someone cares about you enough to stop and ask if you are happy in this situation, if you're comfortable in this situation, is a turn-off? What? That is something that I think people need to take more consideration for. That is the furthest thing from a turn-off. Knowing that someone respects you enough to ask for your boundaries and listen to your boundaries, and know that you can tell them yours, and that's fun and that's great. Why isn't that portrayed? And okay, we can't control 100% what's portrayed in media, but what we can do is allow voices like teens and students to be open and contributing to that. Like you were saying with class before, how teachers are teaching students that are learning things at a different rate, that are experiencing life through a different format. All you need to do is listen to what those students need then. Actually give them the voice to participate in the class that they are in. Because again, there's nothing more hypocritical than having a class of students sit in a room they don't want to be in, and then you're like, but respect is our core. We care what you think, but you have to stay here, and no, you're not allowed to go to the bathroom yet because I'm speaking. That's flawed and broken, and it's okay. The system doesn't need to be perfect. We don't all need to be perfect. We can make mistakes. But establish that as your guideline. Let's talk about this scene that we're studying in class. Yeah. Does anyone actually relate to this? If so, let's chat in a safe environment. I don't know, it's not as, I think, grey as people make it out to be. I think it's easier to be like, oh, we can't change that. Yeah. Oh, well, moving on. Maths, guys, let's go.
100%. And it's the classic, like, I guess, portrayal of in the romantic comedy, like the man grabs the woman and kisses her without asking, and that's romantic. So suddenly a whole generation are growing up watching these kind of things everywhere, and now they're thinking that they're not critically analysing maybe the implications of these displays. So if we were in those environments where, like, young people were shown a romantic comedy scene and were asked, okay, how's I'm struggling with this, Mike. How's consent actually displayed in this? What's the absence? Well, is there an absence of consent? Well, yeah. And kind of giving students a whole bunch of abilities that maybe we learn in English when we're analysing a poem, and apply it to the real world, analysing the media and the text that we're actually kind of being subject to on a daily basis. I think that may be an important aspect of consent education moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. And not taking away the entertainment of it. That's not what it does, but allowing students to think comprehensively and critically about things that interest them. You know, it doesn't need to be this is the checklist, and okay, I spoke about that, so I'm going to check that off, and you said this, so that's done. Just just allow for that to exist where it can. And if that means the student asks a question and it derails the class for 10 minutes, that's okay. There is so much learning and growth in that. And the hard thing to acknowledge, and I guess the hard thing even as an ex-student, is realising the teachers, you're reporting to the teachers, but the teachers are reporting to people above them, and so on and so forth. So therefore, that is what the conversation needs to entail. That needs to go to the bosses, and the bosses need to understand that. And why the system isn't working and what's broken and what's not translating for people, that's a hard conversation to have, because there's so much that goes into it. So even if it's the way media is portraying things, these conversations just need to be allowed to have, but also encouraged to be had. And you will take more steps forward. You just will.
100%. Before we move on to having some of our audience ask a few questions, I'd just like to ask both of you, like obviously we've talked about a range of different ways that consent education could be better and what we want teachers to do and that sort of thing. But coming from both of your experiences in high school and coming out of high school, my question is, if there was one thing that you think would make your consent education and sex education experience better, or one thing you absolutely need teachers to understand that you want, what is that?
For me, I would say nuance. That's been my word of the day. I think that when we're having conversations about consent and sex, it's very black and white. But sex is a complicated thing. And especially as a teenager growing up, and you're in an environment, it happens. Your friends are telling you about this and you're hearing about that. It's something that happens, and I think having nuance to those discussions about the different sort of relationships that can become intimate, and just not shaming anyone. Especially, I feel like there's always an undertone of like, oh, you can do it with your boyfriend or girlfriend, or, you know, you can be that girl and do it with some random. Like, it's always like had this kind of underlining of like, oh, victim shaming, especially, and things talking about not asking for it or the consequences of having sex, rather than a nuanced discussion about sex and how to be safe, especially because I find with a lot of people my age, we haven't been taught how to be safe. And you go on the internet and all you see is just people telling you not to be safe because it's better that way. Things like that, talking about the risk. And you go to school and it's just abstinence, abstinence, abstinence. Don't have sex, you will die. Yep. So you're left wondering, what are you meant to do? You're stuck in this environment. You've got all these conflicting voices telling you, this is what you should do, this is what you should do. No, actually, you should do this. What we need is a nuanced discussion, and what we need is contributions from both adults, whether that be teachers, educators, just people in that field of work, and students and teenagers who are out there experiencing the consequences of our sex education, because the only way that we can improve it is by having a discussion, an honest one first, about the issues within our sex education system.
Yeah, 100% agree. I also think we really need to address how isolated this topic has become. I think isolation is the downfall to a lot of problems that we have. The more you keep people apart, the more tension you create in a subject, and the more alone someone feels, the more internalized judgment and fears and anxieties come out and express themselves in other ways. And the reality is, we don't need to be this isolated from something that we are all largely going to have experiences with in one way or another. We need to make sure that our students and our teachers and anyone that's in this, especially this like so important stage of a person's life, is aware that these things are going to come up and they're not going to be convenient. Someone's going to have a breakdown in maths, and that's okay. And sometimes they're going to have a question and it's going to be at the very end of the lesson, and so, these things aren't always going to go to plan. As long as everyone is aware of it and you're actively trying to include people in this conversation and you're trying to close that gap and eliminate that shame, you're doing well. You're going to be getting there, you know? Yeah.
100% agree with both of you. We have about 10 minutes. If any of our audience have any questions, we have roaming mics, I believe, and we'd love to hear from you.
Joudy, I was wondering, is consent something that comes up in conversations with your peers? Like, is it a taboo topic in just friendship conversations and friendship groups?
Maybe it just might be my friend group, but I feel like all of us together are pretty open about our experiences with sex and consent and intimacy, especially as teenagers. So I think that has been a really good part of a lot of teenagers' lives, is that you find that maybe your school isn't as helpful when it comes to consent, but you'll have friends who are there for you and who are always, as soon as you go out, call me if you need anything. If anything happens, you let me know. And it creates a safe space for a lot of teenagers that I think is truly special, because when a lot of people feel like there's nowhere else you can really go, no one you can talk to, you can't go to your school, the internet is just the internet, and there's just no one you can talk to about it. Having peers at school and having friends and having a very positive environment where sex isn't some taboo, it's just a normal part of the teenage experience, makes it a lot easier to be involved in sex as a teenager. Yeah.
Hi, sorry for Joudy again. Just building on that question, how comfortable are you and your peers talking about that kind of thing with your parents?
I think it varies a lot. For me personally, I come from a more maybe conservative family where it's not that you can't talk about it, it's just very taboo. It's very hush-hush. Don't bring it up at the dinner table. It's not something that needs to be discussed. It's something for when you're an adult, like that kind of thing. So I find that a lot of people and a lot of my friends, we turn to each other in times of need and in times where consent maybe wasn't given, or there's been some iffy vibes about something that you've experienced. A lot of people I know turn towards their friends, maybe even a trusted teacher. But I think maybe just when it comes to my family, it's a very rare kind of thing where you go up to your parents and you tell them, oh, this happened and this happened. But yeah.
This is a question kind of for all three of you. How would you recommend managing students who are unwilling to learn? We're attempting to hold some workshops at our school, and especially when they are clearly harbouring harmful mindsets and ideology, and we are worried that they are perpetrating or just basically not being very nice people to some of the other students, but they're unwilling to sit in on these workshops or participate in these discussions.
It's a great question, and particularly from my experience going to schools, and you don't always have people who want to hear what you have to say. It can be really hard, and there will be students who will disrupt the class and disrupt others from learning. One really helpful tool is at the start of the presentation, the class, whatever, making an agreement. So saying, what you can expect from me is an open discussion where there will be no judgment on my end, and what I expect from you is to engage in that discussion collaboratively, openly, and without judgment too. And then say, can everyone agree to that? And if someone says no, then you basically give them an option to leave, or tell them that, well, if you can't do that, then you're not going to be contributing to a safe space. But the overwhelming majority of times, people will just agree to that, because you sound like a bad person if you're not agreeing to collaboratively engage in discussion, right? And then if someone does disrupt the class or the talk later on, you can cite that agreement that you just made. So you can say at the start of, maybe give a warning, at the start of the day, you all agreed on this, you're currently not upholding that agreement. If you do this again, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And if someone is disrupting the class continuously, it is so much better for the learning of everyone that that person's not involved, particularly after they've made that agreement and been warned. It's a matter of, does that person disrupt everyone, or do they just become, we have to get rid of them for the sake of everyone's learning. I think that agreement's probably a really useful tactic that I guess I've used.
Yeah, and with that, remembering that compassion and respect doesn't equal complacency. You can set your boundaries and you can set your expectations, and especially if you believe not only are harmful ideas floating around, but harmful actions that are hurting other peers, you can set your standard, and if they're not listened to, then there are consequences to that. Then that doesn't mean writing them off as just a bad apple and letting them, just fade into the background. It's actively creating so is it the peer group that they're with that is allowing this behaviour to continue? Is it every time I end up approaching them, it's around this type of person? Is it just in this class? Is it even if I approach them by themselves, are they not receptive? And trying to temper that emotion that comes, and remember that there is a human there with active emotion behind them and reason to what's going on, and it's going to be hard and it's not going to be comfortable, and you're probably going to have to sit and stomach a lot that you don't want to, that you disagree with, but allowing that person to open themselves up, allowing that person to trust you so that you can show them their actions. You can allow them to discover that as well. It might take time, but when you are genuinely trying to help and interact with someone, whether they know it in that moment or not, that will sink in to some extent. It will go in. They may not be receptive right in that moment, but they will remember the conversation had. Things said will land. They will. It might not be visual right then and there, but if it's done with compassion and clear boundaries set, they're going to be receptive to some extent. You've just got to keep the hand there so that eventually they will take it. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, I think one thing that's often overlooked when you're looking at maybe students who have these kind of harmful and bigoted views on consent and sex education is to have a look at their surrounding environment. As a student in high school, I'm in the middle of my teenage years right now, and I can tell you that a lot of the times that teenagers, especially teenage boys, there's often a breeding ground for this kind of toxic views on sex and consent, and you're getting guys talking to each other about, oh my God, this girl's so hot, the things I would do. This kind of very almost harmful opinions can turn into actions, and I think that having a discussion in an area where these guys feel safe to come out with how they're feeling and the thoughts that they might have had or things that they might have said in an area where they don't think they're just going to be given a detention or some sort of consequence is really important for acknowledging that, as sad as it is, it's something that a lot of teenagers go through, is this kind of harmful mindset, this toxic mindset about sex and consent. So I think that observing the surrounding environment and seeing the kind of opinions and offhanded comments that people remark is really important to seeing why these voices and these opinions and sometimes even these actions are starting to arise. So yeah.
100%. I'd love to continue the discussion. It's been a super enjoyable one, very interesting. Your perspectives have been so insightful, so I really appreciate both of you for engaging in that discussion, and for everyone who's joined us today and everyone who's on the live stream. I'm going to wrap up there, but thank you again, and hopefully that this is a discussion that we continue to have in the future, and hopefully staff members start feeling more comfortable with consent education. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.